Next, Mike. So today we have a number of different topics we're going to go through. So I'm going to just do a brief overview of the POC. And there's the fuller introduction and overview of it is available on the NIC Hub. The whole presentation has been recorded and is up there, along with all of the slides. But today we're just going to do a top line of it just to remind people. And then we're going to go into a couple of other recaps. So the Michigan Health Information Exchange held their Interopathon last week, and we'll hear hopefully from Mary if she gets her bandwidth and connectivity, and also Eric Jan, who was he participated as one of the in one of the 9 teams that competed. And that's particularly interesting since it has application to the proof of concept as we go forward. Eric will then talk to us a little bit about a new focus for the NIC, really developing a vocabulary or an ontology of human services. And I'll just touch on that. We'll go into more details on that as we go forward. And then we'll finish up this section, again, fairly quickly, with a review of the person matching. Last week, we had a more in-depth dive into that very complex topic. As you may have recognized when you're a part of it. So we'll go through just a little bit of that. Rita will be talking about that, as well as Mark Vifidiades will actually give us a recap of the Office of National Coordinator event of earlier in the week around person matching. So we'll, after those updates, which should bring everybody up to speed and share some of the exciting stuff, we'll dive into a little bit more work on privacy and confidentiality. Again, this is a very deep and wide topic and applicable to everything we're talking about here. But we're going to just provide a little bit of an overview of it and the context of what we will be doing as we go forward as part of the proof of concept. Privacy and confidentiality is obviously a really important part of it. We'll then break at a little closer to 1:30 probably, hopefully. And for those people who can stay, we'll break you into groups. And we have a couple of prepared questions that we'll engage with. We have moderators who volunteered to participate today, and that will engage in that conversation for about 15, 20 minutes. And then we'll come back and do some debrief. And then we'll close out for the rest of the day there. So that's the agenda. Put your running shoes on. We'll get started now. So Mike, next slide, please. So briefly, I've spoken about the NIC in the past. It's a community of networks. The idea basically is to share information across multiple domains, especially in light of both the opioid crisis and the COVID crisis. We clearly recognize the need for cross-domain interoperability, information sharing, and that's become really more clear as time has gone on, and the implications and the impact on all of our systems as a result of this. That's really the core idea behind NIC, and that was recognized by Kresge Foundation, who has generously supported this work over the last number of years. So I encourage you to look more into that if it's of interest to you. There's a publication that is called In the Nick of Time. There's the icon for it over there. And that goes into each of the domains in some greater detail and looks at the interconnection between those things that are common and different. So that's really the underlying aspect of what we're talking about here. Thanks. Next slide, Mike. So just briefly, coming attractions. Next week, we're going to actually have a global discussion about the impact of COVID on health and human services with a number of presenters. Alfonso Montero, who runs the European Social Network, which it brings together about 36 countries and about 120 organizations across Europe and Eastern Europe, kind of like APHSA is for us here. Also, Dr. Forrest from the University of Calgary, and also Dr. Karen Smith, who's not on this list right now, who was formerly the director of the California Department of Public Health. That will be hopefully a very wide-ranging conversation about policy and implementation, things we can learn from one another across the proverbial pond. Following that, the following week, we'll Here are some from the Sequoia Network, who is now the recognized coordinating entity from Marianne Yeager. It in many ways sort of completes our series on the federal accelerator project. Sequoia has been around for a while and is just doing really amazing work in helping coordinate a lot of the national efforts. And then at the end of June, we'll be launching the National Action Agenda with our team and Stanford University. As I've spoken about in the past, the larger strategy here is to really focus on the next 7, 8, 9 months and what it is that we can possibly do to affect the future direction of health and human services at this critical time. And you'll be receiving more notifications about that, especially if you're signed up for the hub. Moving along. So I'm just going to provide again a brief overview just to put us all on the same page. And again, all this stuff is on the hub if you want to go into more detail, list both the slides and also the presentation. So advance, please. So in a nutshell, I might say this statement really reflects what the Project Unify is about. As I mentioned, we have been developing the National Interoperability Collaborative for quite a while. Last fall, we identified the opportunity and the need to perhaps do something that was tangible. And so this work has been evolving and maturing over time. And this pretty well states it in terms of our interest in implementing a proof of concept that really can demonstrate both a replicable and a standards-based information sharing and interoperability across a variety of health, education, human services domains, education as well, and public safety. And we want to achieve the vision by really working collaboratively within an open source, open API technology environment and framework. So a lot of the people on the call and a lot of people who are participating in Unify are putting their proverbial shoulders to the flywheel, and we're making some real progress. And we'll encourage and employ you to join that effort as we go forward here. Next slide, please. Right now, the proof of concept is, again, there's a lot of people who've signed up. There's about 200 people who've signed up for the group, and there's a core group of folks who are participating from across different sectors and have a variety of different technical skills that they're bringing to the table. You can see some of their names here. They may be familiar to you. There are certainly other people who are involved, and I apologize if your name is not up here. But I just wanted to show the breadth and the depth of participants in this work as we go forward. And a lot of representation from not only social and human services, but also from healthcare, education, and public health, of course. Next. This slide, as we refer to it as our Ferris Wheel slide, is a representation of a little bit of noise there. See if we can delete it. Thank you very much. This is trying to create a graphic representation of really what strategically what we're trying to do. At the center is the client of our work, an individual or family, and the actual sort of pizza slices here represent the various disciplines. They actually correspond mostly with the 6 domains we've talked about in the past, but it's a way to visualize the actual domains, the services they provide, the people who are actually touching or working with the client. So it's a graphical way of demonstrating that. There are clearly other programs embedded in that, and we plan to continue to evolve and develop this graphic so that it's representative of the variety of programs and types of people involved in it. But I think from a particularly from a how do you portray the complexity of this work in one slide? I think this is one way to think about it. There was a suggestion to add workforce, of course, here, given the dramatic situation we're faced now. And so, as I said, we'll be evolving that and also being able to look at other sort of major contributors to the overall interoperability conversation. Next slide, please. So in the middle, we are focused on a scenario or a use case that is really based on the integrated care for kids model. You may be familiar with that. It's a program that was launched earlier in the year by CMMI, and it's a 7-year program to really demonstrate in many ways the interoperability between a variety of programs: health, foster care, social and human services, education, the courts. And we have a number of folks from the Integrated Care for Kids program on the call, and we've been collaborating closely with New Jersey and a number of other sites. So the proof of concept is not only conceptually important and interesting, but it also represents actual implementation that will be happening over the next number of years. So we're really excited about the opportunity to provide support around a framework, an architectural framework that all of them could potentially use, or many of them could use. So we actually are able to replicate and minimize the duplication that may exist out there. And again, there's a bunch more around that in some of the other slide decks here. And I want to thank folks who are involved with Integrated Care for Kids who have been really informing our efforts and making it very tangible and very real. So if you can advance one more. Dave, are you with us here? You on the call?
Yeah, I'm with you, Daniel.
Okay, I just wanted to give you a couple minutes. We had created a kind of an architectural framework. We're not gonna have time to go into this in detail, but if you can just touch on some of the key points here, just to orient people to it, that would be fantastic.
Sure. What we're doing here is just giving a 50,000-foot view of the things that we want to accomplish in the architecture. For example, if we look on the left-hand side, we talk about issues such as governance, capabilities such as person matching, specifically person matching across domains. How do we exchange this data and so forth? So capabilities. And then we look at the integration standards that we're going to be using. And although we intend to use a number of different standards, such as fire and CDEDs and so forth, the one that has the most attention right now is fire. So what we're trying to do is use that as our learning environment as to how to implement interoperability. Towards the right-hand side of the screen, there is what is my hot button, which is the user interface. And that is the way that any individual interfaces into this myriad of services that are out there. And that's going to include things such as the actual graphical user interface itself. You know, some of the goals that we've got in mind is to make it elegant, to make it simple for people to use. One of the discussions that we're going to be having is who will be the user? Are individuals that are recipients going to be addressed through this user experience, or is it going to focus more on caregivers, providers, and so forth? So as we go through it, we're going to be having that discussion about who is the target audience for the user experience that we're going to be providing. Some of that clearly is going to be desktop applications where you need a lot of real estate to be presenting a lot of data. And some of it is going to go all the way down to mobile applications, phone applications, and so forth. So we've started to implement some of those. And what we'd like to do is have a breakout group that's going to help drive where that's going to. And then there are the core components to the system, such as fire implementations, data access, and so forth. And one of the big pieces for us, and we're going to talk about it a little bit today, is security in terms of access to this data. That's going to be a complex approach. And as we look at it going forward, my vision is, and using fire as an example, there will be millions of resources that we're gaining access to. So it could be Daniel's appointment record, it could be lab results for myself. There'll just be a whole myriad of resources that we're accessing. And one of the really important parts of that is that we're going to stay in sync with the rest of the world as we go to actually implement this. Because if we all do it differently, if we all manage access to these resources and the security that surrounds that differently, then it's just not going to work. There's got to be some standard approach so that an individual can get to this whole myriad of data. And we're going to be walking through that at a high level initially, and then actually integrate that into the user experience. I can give you a quick example, and that is—
Dave, I think let's hold off on the example now. I think we want to move along. I think it's a good choice of kind of giving an overview here. As you can see, there's a lot of complexity and detail here that we'll be getting into in greater detail with the various subgroups that are working on the project. So we will spend time as we go forward. So thanks, Dave. If you could advance one more. So as Dave was saying, there's a lot of this work falls into breakout groups, or not breakout groups, but work groups. And so far we've started to address person matching. And today we'll talk a little bit about privacy and confidentiality. Some of the other ones we will be working on in greater detail as we go forward are the platforms, standards harmonization, UX, UI, and governance and equity kinds of conversations. So there's plenty of work and plenty of thinking that's going to go on. And a lot of that will be with and amongst you. So we encourage you to go to the site, look at what interests you, what you want to learn about, what you want to contribute to, and sign up. Let us know what your main interests are. And so with that, let's transition. I think this is moving right along now. Yeah. So here we are. We're moving to the next section, which is a kind of a brief overview of very exciting work, Interopathon, that recently happened. And I'm hoping that, Mary, are you on with us now? Have you gotten connectivity? And the answer is maybe not. Mary?
I don't believe we have audio. Is that Mary Kratz?
Yes.
Yeah, I see her. Oh, she's coming into the audio now.
Okay. Hey, Mary.
Oh, it failed.
Give it one more minute. I know she was having a little difficulty before.
Yeah, it looks like it's failed a couple of times.
Okay, so let me do this. Let me do this, Mary. When you get on, just either just jump into the conversation or chat us. I'm just going to do just a quick overview, very quick, and then I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who is actually working on one of the teams. And then if you come back on later, we can kind of give a little bit more of an overview there. Does that make sense? And let me check to see if you're on yet with us. No. Okay, so we have a little audio issues there as well. So Mahan hosted the Interopathon last week. And if you could advance a little bit, there were a number of tracks that were prepared, including the Karen Alliance, Da Vinci Gravity, and also Project Unify was one of the tracks, and there was an open track as well. And I think there were about 65 or 70 programmers who were involved in basically developing actual applications that were related to the data sets that were provided by each of the tracks there. And if you could advance, there were 9 teams submitted. You can see
Is
Karen.
Mary,
Mary, are you there?
Hello.
Oh, hey, there you go. Great.
My sincerest apologies. I had 5 mutes and didn't quite figure it out. The network situation here in Michigan this morning has been just a little bit daunting. For just briefly a bit more detail, that as Daniel had shared, we did an event called an Interopathon, which is a Connectathon-like event, but taking interoperability and Connectathon in really a unique forum where Connectathons a lot of time are a vendor or trying to define a standard, really putting up a persistent test bed, bringing a community together. And this particular Interopathon was focused by what we referred to as a crossfire event, where we had representation on a program committee from the leaders from all of the HL7 fire accelerators. So that came together with challenges laid out for the participants in the development Connectathon portion, which we make fun and have kind of a competition type of format. 9 teams in total did a variety of submissions. The first on Karen, which was a mobile app dealing with consumer access. The second, Da Vinci, is the fire accelerator that deals with payer to provider transactions. So I had a couple of different submissions there. One that was a provider acts looking at closing the gap between those payers and providers. The second was really focused around prior auth. The next team came together around Gravity that looked at solutions for social determinants of health using the HL7 defined implementation guide for housing security. Then we're delighted to have Eric Jan join with the Interoperability Institute technical team, and to bring together just an early preliminary prototype of the HL7 fire test bed that my team has implemented, that we refer to as Interoperability LAN, with the HS Link test bed, and looked at doing some development around Project Unify and coordination of care for the homeless. So really exciting submission there. Next slide, please. The next we had was an open track requested by the program committee that anyone who perhaps with other data standards or other challenges would like to provide a submission. This was a consumer-driven app that looked at a whole bunch of disparate data to bring together patient health stories and history. The 7th submission was again around Project Unify, looking at automating a screening platform for SDOH and health information. And then the last 2 again were OpenTrack, looking at longitudinal healthcare information provider to provider, and the final submission, connecting providers to other providers. So very, very exciting that coming together in 2 days, we actually had 9 submissions of code. Next slide, please. That we will be making available in the Interoperability Institute Git repository. So available to this community, basically available in the public domain, and certainly for continued development. I think the exciting piece of what we do with the Interopathon is using the Interoperability LAN testbed, which is essentially a simulation of a health information exchange. We actually have a persistent testbed where communities can come together and can look vendor to vendor, can look across the ecosystem. And so providing that as a persistent test bed, but also if an organization wants to utilize that platform internal to their organization, we make that available. It comes preloaded with synthetic data, so no concern about PHI. And we're super excited to see some of the preliminaries around Project Unify and working with the NIC to be able to further enable that. Eric, just turning it over to you if you want to say a few words about those early first iterations of HL7 and the health and human services side. Really appreciate your engagement in the Interopathon and working with the two teams and enabling two solutions coming into the GitHub repository for Project Unify. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Mary, we really appreciated the opportunity to participate in the Interopathon. It was a great experience, and just looking forward to doing more in the future, ratcheting it up, and getting more done each subsequent attempt at this. So thank you so much. I want to talk about two topics. I'm Eric Yan, the CTO of HSLink, which is an open source human services platform as a service. It's like a Salesforce, but open source, but for human services. So if that made any sense, that's what we are. I'm going to be talking about two topics. One is our experience during the Interopathon and what we learned and next steps for the platform based on what we learned. And then I'm going to quickly talk about a proposal for a new project for the National Interoperability Collaborative, which is sorely needed, involving ontologies and vocabularies for human services. And maybe not just nationally, but maybe worldwide. So I'll cover that at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the key things we learned from, we knew this going in, but it just became very highlighted throughout the process that open source APIs are critical for this to work. Not necessarily the code, but the APIs have to be, so that these solutions can be used furthered in other applications after the Interopathon. Lessons can be shared, people can make their own implementations. We really just feel that open source APIs are where the future has to move. And we're happy to contribute our open source APIs, but we don't see that as an end all to this process. We want to see more open source APIs built on open source models. The other thing is we really need mapped domain-specific vocabularies that are all on the same level. And that level I would define as web ontologies. It has to be on the web. It has to be done in a way that's standardized, that's used worldwide. And so I'll talk about this a little later on, but the web ontology language is definitely the best for that. And it's the World Wide Web Consortium has defined that standard. FHIR is already defined in that format, and the reference implementation model, the RIM, if I got that acronym right, that HL7 uses is defined in that as well. Social determinants of health could be mapped using those standards, and HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System standard, could be defined in that standard. It isn't yet. NEAM isn't yet. They're moving there, but we're trying to figure out how to get there as fast as possible. Once we've got everything on the same plane as far as the representation of entities in a model, in a vocabulary, we can do a lot. People can really go to town because that's exactly what these standards are made for, is mapping and linking things together that may not be obvious how to do that otherwise. Next slide, please. So we had a track. We called it the Project Unify track at the Interopathon. And two teams, teams 10 and 12, went about it completely differently, but they, with varying success, created one app that got information out of the healthcare system and then used it to inform the human services intake process. And then the other app went the other direction. It started with a clinical visit, actually, and then brought in the human services information into that context. So these are actually two different, I guess, scenarios that Gravity is. I think they have 3 for social determinants of health, but these are the first 2. One each has a different direction of the screener information flow. from or to the healthcare information system. So we didn't ask the teams to do it, but they did it on their own. Team 12 went health to human services, and Team 10 went human services to health. So pretty cool. Next slide, please. So one thing that was both fun and challenging and frustrating were the HS Link's concept of trusted apps. Started off kind of with the kind of like a Facebook style notion of a trusted app, not anything to do with their implementation or their reputation or any of that, but the idea being that you're an app registered for a platform, and it doesn't have to be HS Link, it could be any human services platform, uses the same ideas as Smart on Fire, but not involving health-centric concepts, and should be compatible with Smart on Fire over the long term. But the idea is that there's an onboarding registration process for an app to associate with a platform, one of many that implements the open APIs, and then each app can be monitored and held accountable for its behavior on that platform. And that was difficult for many of the apps starting up to understand how to become a trusted app. Next slide, please. And how to become a trusted app, and how to use the tokens of that app within the platform. So backing up a little, there were 3 major lessons we learned from this whole thing. These are things that we sort of knew heading into it, at least the first one. We need the screeners to be defined in relation to the HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Homeless Management Information System model. So this will happen as Gravity releases, goes beyond the draft specification for housing instability. So that would be a great project to get a web ontology for those screeners, and also to get HMIS as a web ontology. Then we're all on the same level as FHIR. We would like to have push notifications in the hackathon, in the Interopathon. The apps would have to request information from HS Link at intervals. It'd be better if they just subscribe to get those notifications, and then when the social determinant screener was triggered, or a new data element or new data value was received by this platform, it would push it to the apps that would handle it when it arrives. Another thing we learned is that our golden view, which is kind of like the 360-degree view of a client, which is their households, their enrollments, the surveys they've taken, all just personal identifiers and such, that needs to be easier to use. It needs to be more browsable. It didn't have all the households in one step. So we can improve that a little bit as well. We've learned from the Interopathon. We thought it was actually solid, but I see that it could be smoother for the developers. Next slide, please. We need more prep time. Our platform was basically meant for onboarding customers, more like 1 a week, 1 a month, as opposed to 6 all in 1 hour. And so we need to make it work faster and smoother. The basics of how to register, workflows of how you just generally use the platform. You search first, then you get your IDs, and then you look into those. It just has to be handled up front before the hackathon. We can speed up the trusted app process, automate it, improve the workflow. There's a user interface for it. There's an app that can be less clunky. A lot of times they thought they were getting something done, and it was just waiting for more from them. So we can improve that. We can also put the instructions, the how-to instructions, in the onboarding as a quick refresher course, as opposed to getting them onboarded and then sending them links to documents. And then we should probably just get everybody set up before the hackathon, and then they can actually roll up their sleeves during the hackathon, as opposed to figuring out how to get started at the beginning. So next slide, please. So next steps, I'd like to look at the source code, figure out what worked for them, where people gravitate towards using the platform, using HS Link's APIs, and just get some clues about where we could make the APIs faster and easier. We want to plan more hackathons, some health-centric, some perhaps meme courts, child services, all sorts of, or family services, all sorts of different hackathons with different focuses for Project Unify, because Project Unify has other use scenarios that don't involve social determinants of health, or it could involve all of the scenarios at once. And then, you know, we really need to get these new features added, which we're working on feverishly. Next slide. So I already said, you know, we should.
I was just going to say,
Daniel?
Matt threw in a question here around the Gravity project is currently reviewing standard HMIS screeners for potential fireproof. I wanted to call your attention to that question, and also for people who may be new to hackathons, kind of what the direct application might be. What are they going to see as a result of this, and as we go forward? Can you just briefly address that?
I'm sorry, what they'll see as a result of the Interopathon tracks?
Yeah.
Well, I know that the apps will all be posted, you know, as Mary said, and you'll see how the platform was used in conjunction with the Fire server and HS-Link, and so you'll have some practical examples. There's others out there that we can share as well outside of the Interopathon, and I just think this hackathon is very much a test run for this sort of thing. It hasn't really been done before. You know, the social determinants of health were fresh off the, no, they were drafts. They weren't even fresh off the press. The press was still running. And so it's, I really wanted to use this one as a what do you call it? A trial run to figure out what all needs to happen to make the next one just awesome. So yeah, a lot of like the cookies are still being baked, you know, sort of thing.
That's great. Okay.
Let's see. Next, let's keep it on this slide. Sorry. Push notifications. I talked about that. The also last thing is we should really try to get consent, which is going to be a topic at the end of this call, integrated into HS-Link. Now I know that there's different methodologies people are proposing. One of them that's come into popularity is the use of a distributed ledger blockchain to do consent. So I'd like to just implement that, see how it goes. And that could be a way that consent could be shared with the Fire servers. Now, we're just going to be testing it out. It would be something that would be synced optionally, and try it out. Right now, we just have the consent stored on the platform, and then they'd have to look it up, which is not distributed and not shared to the other servers. So let's see how that goes. Next slide, please. Sorry. So that was the end of my topic for the hackathon or the Interopathon Redux. So what I want to talk about really quickly, and I'm very gracious to Daniel for allowing me to present this. I'm going to just take 5 minutes on this, but we need, and I've alluded to this in the past in the foregoing presentation, we need a human services vocabulary, a web ontology slash vocabulary, whatever you want to call it. I guess ontologies are more in-depth, vocabularies are more casual. But it's the same idea, same representation methodology. So what we do is what I'd like to do for the NIC, and I know it's a national interoperability collaborative, but I'd like to look at worldwide standards. We can learn a lot from them, and these web ontologies really don't have boundaries, and there's a lot that's reusable from them nationally as well. So I'd like to catalog the ontologies that exist, and then identify gaps in those ontologies, look at popular non-web ontologies, non-web vocabularies, and nominate them to be converted. HMIS would be a great one. Fire's already done. NEAM, we're talking about it. It's not done yet. A lot of great stuff, a lot of gaps that exist, but a lot of great work that can be quickly done to get things all on the same plane. Then based on those built out vocabularies that we've got, including the huge amount of existing ones out there in the world, let's propose some new APIs and workflows, including existing APIs that could use those vocabularies under the hood based on all this steps 1 and 2, the former steps. So this would essentially lead us to a human services functional equivalent to the fire and RIM models. You know, something that would be able to interoperate much better than the different representations of models that exist out there in different formats in human services. And also for NEAM, which is broader than human services. So, you know, moving to the next week's topic with the EU social network, or the European Social Networks presenter, Alfonso Montero. Really, the world is shrinking. They've got vocabularies. We should probably not be doing things completely different than them. We can learn a lot from those other groups and around the world, not just the Europe, and move things forward much more quickly that way. That's the end of my presentation. I'm just going to stop here and open it up for any comments.
Eric, I was going to say that I was going to suggest that we could even send Alfonso a couple of questions in advance, because we were actually talking with him this morning about the agenda for next week and the conversation. So it'll be interesting to propose that and see what kind of similarities and differences there may be. A lot of the vendors, of course, work globally. So, so we may have to change it from the National Interoperability Collaborative to the Global Interoperability Collaborative. But that would not be a bad thing. Any other questions? Ideas that people want to bring in now?
Eric, this is Greg Bloom, and you know, this brings me back to the days of 2013 when you and I talked about the need for human service ontology. And I guess my question now is, I think the same as then, which is, you know, that's not a new call. I've heard that before in the literature. It seems like people have tried it many times over the years. So, you know, assuming this is not the first time somebody has said, you know, we need a global ontology that maps all the vocabularies. What do you think went wrong in previous attempts? Because many have tried, and as far as I know, nobody has succeeded. And what do you think that's different?
Oh, sorry to interrupt, Greg. Well,
just what do you think would need to be different in a future attempt to map a global vocabulary that contains all concepts and all knowledge?
Maybe back then we talked about, I can't remember what we said, Greg, but this is not that. It's not a global ontology. It's essentially, the cool thing about web ontologies is every little ontology, many of them are existing already, just get cobbled together. In other words, I propose we add two new ones from work that I'm involved with or know of, and that would be the National Information Exchange Model as an ontology. And they're getting close to that. They've got the representations in JSON LD, which is, you know, JSON linked data and such. Homeless Management Information System. It's just a matter of, you know, so many hours of work to just translate their existing XML schema to an ontology. So it's not like we'd be making one that everybody has to adhere to, but more of getting a hold of, you know, being more conscious of what's already out there, and then linking it together and reusing things that already exist. So it's more like a stitching task than a masonry task of building something, you know, afresh. And so I think back then, you know, a lot of this stuff was newer, and now, you know, we've got the people building these artifacts. We've already got healthcare on where it needs to be as far as this stuff. They had the foresight to build all this in the last decade since, you know, we've talked about it. But yeah, it's just things have moved forward, and we're in a much better place. I remember back then, you know, NEAM was just starting a human services domain back in 2012, and you know, they were arguing over, should we have JSON or XML schema? Well, nobody argues about that too much anymore. It's kind of like, yeah, do whatever you want, we'll convert it. You know, so we're just in, I think, a different place. We've grown up. The world has continued on its, you know, ontologies and vocabularies. A lot of it's not even health or human services. It's stuff for provenance, stuff for V cards. You know, just all sorts of utility stuff that can be brought into our health and human services vocabularies and extended from there. Does that answer your question or comment, or Greg?
Yeah, I think the prospect of mapping existing vocabularies together is really promising.
I think there's some agreement in the chat here. So I look forward to, Eric, you leading that conversation, and we're adding another tab to the work group there, and engage Matt and Matthew and bring another in that conversation as we go forward. So what I'd like to do is transition now to the last section of this part, which is a brief overview of the person matching, and hear both from Rita for a quick orientation, and then from Mark about the national the ONC meeting of the week. So thank you much, Rita. You.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
Do you want to move to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay, there we go. So how do we advance cross-sector sharing across the variety of health and human services programs an individual may encounter? So the Project Unify team is working on several complex issues, such as what Eric described and others chimed in regarding domain vocabularies. And that's extremely important to address many aspects of cross-sector interoperability. As is depicted in this slide that we introduced last week when Pradeep discussed matching, addressing matching is essential to be able to correctly identify where information exists on an individual across the different systems where they may live, and also to link those records, such as in some of the use cases that Eric and others have talked about between like HMIS and health and whatnot. There are many different issues that have to be considered, and specifically with matching, there are different types of data and of course vocabularies in different domains. But with matching specifically, there are different methods and standards that are used to capture and format data. And there's also different ways that systems identify individuals and requirements for data, whether particular attributes have to be captured and whatnot. And also the team will also probably be looking at new approaches that may involve security and other solutions. So we can move to the next slide. And then kind of looking at sort of the path forward and potential solutions, we really want to leverage work that's already being done in initiatives discussed, like Gravity. There's also others that are sponsored through ONC, like the Fire at Scale Task Force, and other national efforts that are really already tackling or have tackled some of these questions. And in the process, we also want to attract experts to work on these and other challenges. Some of those that are highlighted here really focus on just like different methods of matching, privacy and security to support and increase trust and prevent harms, perhaps how capabilities such as provenance can be leveraged, and different architectures that come into play. You can all, I mean, there's other things on the slide and otherwise that also are important. But I think at this point, we can really just turn it over to Mark to recap what ONC looked at earlier in the week and what they're doing.
Great, thank you, Rita. And we can move to the next slide. Great. As was mentioned, ONC held a person matching workshop on Monday. It was a day-long session. And ONC actually was asked again to study the issue and report back to Congress. And you know how slow the wheels of government sometimes turn. By the time we're done, it's probably going to be the end of the year. I'm being honest with everybody, just so that you all know. But we did, there've obviously been technical options and public perceptions that have changed since this was first studied in the late 90s, biometrics, for example. And identity management in clinical practice remains a huge and significant issue within healthcare institutions, not to mention human services. Reporting in the clinical practice example, reporting actual patient harm and significant financial expense. And these, again, are big motivators for us to study this and get something done about it. We can go to slide 2, by the way. So, you know, there are many forms of patient and person identifying, and there are organizations, medical organizations that are great at identifying their own patients. For example, I used to work for Kaiser Permanente and everybody had a medical record number. But so that was great for folks within Kaiser when they went in for labs or into the pharmacy to see specialists. And when they went in the hospital, everything was under one roof. But of course, we know that isn't the case. So we really need to come up with a solution. Unfortunately, again, being totally honest with what happened at the workshop, there weren't any really definitive private sector solutions identified. In the morning, we talked about all the challenges. We had great speakers, by the way, and it was fast moving. In the morning, we had speakers identifying the problems and talking about a lot of the challenges. And in the afternoon, we had people coming up with different solutions. But again, that was the first step. We anticipate that there'll be additional data gathering, both from federal partners and from the public during this, for example, at our ONC technical forum, which will be happening this summer. And right now, we have not yet formulated any recommendations. But again, this is something that we hope to do, especially by the end of the year. We can actually move on to the next slide. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go back. We did move to that slide. Yeah. So, one of the things with patient matching or person matching is there are people that are saying, yes, we need to get this done right away. For example, a national patient identifier or a universal patient identifier. So you have people that are so into that and really want to move that forward. But then you have people on the other side. We have the naysayers, as Brian mentioned. Brian was on the call on Monday as well. So you have people that are putting up all kinds of red flags, why this would be a bad idea. Privacy, for example. So again, this is the challenge. You have people on both sides of the issue and there are roadblocks. It's very similar to the ONC and the CMS interoperability rule, the final rule, which we're implementing for interoperability. You have people that are saying, what took so long? This needed to be done a long time ago. This is great for public health. This is great for individuals' health. But then you have people that are really reticent about doing it because of privacy concerns and so forth. So these are some of the problems that we're having in getting this done. And again, person matching is so important for so many different reasons, but these are some of the challenges we've encountered, and this is some of the things that were discussed on Monday. Again, we will, during our summer ONC technical forum, be discussing this a lot more, and we'll be taking in more public comments. And again, the first step toward person matching is patient matching in the medical world. There are so many motivators to get that done. And I believe that once that's done, it's going to be easy to then transition to having person matching more universal, such as including human services and community-based organizations and so forth. New York, there are, again, organizations that are really doing a great job. For example, in New York, their Health Information Network, they have some great solutions. And these are some of the things that we need to discuss when talking about success stories that may be able to be scaled nationally. I'm open to any comments right now. Anyone else that was on the workshop on Monday, or if there are any questions that I can answer. And yes, I do see a question asking if the ONC meeting was recorded. It was recorded. It has to go through a process of making sure that it's all compliant before it'll be back available, but it will be available on the ONC website. And when we hear when it's available, we can actually share that link with everyone.
Great.
This is Brian Hansbecker. Just if you don't mind, Mark, I just wanted to throw in another couple of thoughts.
Oh, yes, please do. I know you had some great comments as well, so I'm looking forward to that.
Well, I'd originally written these 3 bullets as part of a broader, what had originally been the subject line of an email of notes from the ONC meeting. And then I was asked to turn it into a blog article where I thought, well, I'll make it thoughts from the ONC meeting. Somewhere along the way, it's been elevated to ponderings from the ONC meeting. However, I'll take ownership of the actual ponderings here. And one of them was that what I wrote in the blog article, which you can find on the NIC forum on the hub, was that there are some good reasons for doing a universal patient identifier. There are some benefits to it, but that having a universal patient identifier or a national patient identifier doesn't completely eliminate the need for effective patient matching. Depending on the algorithm you use for your check digits and for error correction and human factors and all manner of other things, there's still the potential for somebody to have fat fingers and kick a digit or 3 or 5. And there are lots of stories that I've heard over the years of, some clerk somewhere along the way that just decided to do, a cut and paste of an ID to multiple different records because they were just too lazy to look up the real ID for a particular client or patient. So there are all kinds of ways to mess with a system that still require us to have a system in place that does matching. And that's especially true when you start talking, as we are within Project Unify, across not just healthcare, but healthcare and human services and education and the courts and who knows what other information domains we'll end up working with. So that's the reason that I pointed out bullet number 3, that there were some folks that were still focused on the gory details of multi-factor matching, and even, kicking it up a notch to referential matching, where once you've matched somebody, you can go back to a reference repository of known good matches so that you don't have to be constantly rematching, recalculating a match between multiple different databases for a particular client or patient ID. So those were my thoughts on it. UPI, great idea. It's going to really help some vendors, some healthcare payers and healthcare providers, but not a panacea to all of the problems associated with patient matching. So let's not overlook the good work that folks like New York State and Verado, Allscripts, APRIS, et cetera, have been doing in this space. Over.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, there are many challenges to a universal patient ID or national patient identifier. And the human part of that is a big challenge. There are people that just they're just so afraid of having some kind of identifier that will follow them. They really concerned about privacy. And again, it's a problem in the healthcare world, even again within vertically integrated healthcare organizations, where people don't want to give their information for one reason or another. So we have to get past that as well. That's why, and again, it was forbidden really for us to set that up after HIPAA in the 1990s, but that has now changed, and we are charged with looking into that. So at least people are more open to it. People realize the importance of being able to identify people. But again, it is challenging. So if there are some private sector solutions, being able to, again, use biometrics, or maybe, a bunch of authentication devices such as a cell phone, which has so many different ways of identifying an individual, that maybe would be a great way to do it. But this is what we're trying to collect between now and the end of the year to report back to Congress. Congress is well aware of this problem and of the folks that have contacted them and told them how important it is to solve this. So again, we're in a good spot in that finally people are realizing how important this is, not only within the healthcare community, but in human services. So hopefully this will lead to something. And again, obviously we all know that COVID has put a lot of this into the spotlight. So things have accelerated because of that as well. Again, the importance of that, including contact tracing. So we may be able to move forward with this.
Well, we are certainly hoping to advance that work in a very practical application, as we talked about with Integrated Care for Kids. And I know that they're sitting with bated breath on figuring out how to do that. So I hope that as the work of the ONC proceeds, and the NIC procedures, we're able to learn from one another, both from our private sector partners and from others from the government, federal, state, local government, to make that, figure out how to, what's out there and what might be most effective. So.
Absolutely. And again, one final thought, just to follow up on that. Again, we talk about, again, within the healthcare community, patient matching, but we at ONC are acutely aware of how important it is to integrate, as I've mentioned previously, human services, social determinants, community information, community health information, and so forth. So there's so many of us at ONC that are really working hard to get that done. And many of us, even on this call today from ONC, are so happy to be working with you all.
I appreciate that very much, Mark. And as does the rest of the group there. So let's pivot now and talk a little bit about the confidentiality and privacy work. So advance the slide here. I think this obviously is as much as person matching is complex, I'm certain that everyone has pulled out their hair around privacy models and frameworks, especially across multiple domains. So our intention here is just to, again, provide an overview of the topic that's going to become a sort of a focal area, one of multiple focal areas within the PLC, to really bring the best thinking around that to the table. And so we can all benefit from some of the emerging and evolving work. So I've asked Brian to kind of give an overview. We'll take questions as it's going along here. And we have about 30 minutes to have that, so about 25 minutes to have that conversation. So please, let's go ahead.
Actually, why don't you let me do an introduction of myself, Daniel.
Great. Thank you, Brian.
I'm Brian Hanspicker. I'm, amongst other industry responsibilities and consulting gigs, I'm CTO, Chief Technology Officer for Open City Labs. Relatively new posting for me, role for me. Next slide. But I've also been working with the Stewards of Change Institute, who have lots of experience guiding agencies and organizations through the wide-ranging issues associated with privacy. This mural is the output of one such engagement, and it covers the many faceted aspects of privacy and what you need to do in order to get as an organization to the point where you can say, yes, we can access, we can share, we can use data to benefit the wellness of individuals and populations, individuals, families, and populations. For example, there's on the right-hand side, there's a good discussion of the legal issues involved, including the rather amusing cartoon of a lawyer who's shown up early to the process. But on the left-hand side, we get into questions associated with the principles of patient or client ownership of their data, their wellness data. And that includes the protected identifying information that we might be using for patient and client matching, for example. It also includes, once you've matched some records within healthcare human services databases, the patient medical records, the human services case records, the educational transcripts. At the same time that we assert that there's this principle of ownership, on the right-hand side, you can see the first check mark is getting the right balance. Because if you don't find the right balance of obligations for both protecting and accessing and sharing data, you can't very well provide support for personal health care or provide the social services for a family. Or for that matter, help with public health, like pandemics, or deal with justice issues. So we need to ensure that access to information, especially sensitive and protected personal information, is able to be directly or indirectly controlled by the patient or client to the degree of granularity of their circumstances. And that means that, for instance, if they have a patient medical record that they're willing to share with from one doctor to another doctor, they can share the entire record. But if they're a victim of domestic abuse, they may not want to have their address fields within that medical record shared for their own personal protection. And that creates requirements that that define the range of privacy on the information that's to be shared. The next slide, please. Next slide. We've covered this already. Child foster care is one of those extreme use cases because for each child in state care, there are legislative requirements at the federal and state levels on child and family welfare agencies that require them to collect and store all information associated with a child in state care, such as a foster child or a client of the juvenile justice system, and store that information separate from the source systems for that child until the child turns 18 or 21. And these records range from healthcare records and prescription records to educational transcripts, family court records, foster care, adoption, juvenile justice and court records, protective services records, disability, rehabilitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. And each of these different kinds of records is covered by a different sets of privacy legislation that have subtly different aspects to them, determining who's allowed to see this information, who's allowed to share it, what mechanisms need to be put in place in order to be able to share it, et cetera. Next. So with that in mind, keep in mind that privacy and confidentiality are just a very small part of a fairly complicated, much larger, independent and interdependent set of security and privacy issues, ranging from, are you who you really say you are, authentication, to are you authorized to see a particular piece of information? If you're authorized to see, how much of that information are you allowed to see? And how do we ensure that the information that you're looking at hasn't changed somewhere along the way by some nefarious person in the middle, trying to change your records for their own benefit? So next slide. Okay, we seem to have missed a slide here. No? Okay. There had been in the slides that we were working with yesterday, a nice slide showing that the privacy itself was fairly complex in its own right, having to do with not just markings on individual pieces of information, but management of consents from end users, to the ability for people to electronically exchange those consents at the time that somebody needs to use that information. There you go. Just in time, though I'm now ready to move on to one. The whole area of privacy and confidentiality management can be very, very sophisticated, especially within the healthcare world, with standards such as data segmentation for privacy, fire security labels, as well as a mechanism that at least simplifies things from an end user's point of view, from a patient's point of view, with technology created by SAMHSA called consent to share. And that's where we get to the next slide. And I want to turn it over to Tom if he's available.
I am, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes. All yours.
Yeah, so as Brian so eloquently laid out, one of the things that we see is that there are a lot of policies, a lot of agreements, a lot of variety in policies and laws as you go from state to state. It's sort of all over the map in terms of issues of information privacy and what people have to do relative to things like HIPAA, FERPA, et cetera. And one of the tools we have in our kit bag for Project Unify, I guess I should say, we're probably not going to be able to address everything in Project Unify, at least at the beginning. But one piece that we can focus on is the notion of informed affirmative consent vis-a-vis 42 CFR Part 2, which is the law that requires informed consent with respect, specifically with respect to substance abuse information. So as Brian mentioned, the part of putting the patient at the center of their care, SAMHSA created a mobile app. It's actually a Smart on Fire app that handles consent, takes consent out of a paper form and moves it into the electronic realm. And you can see a picture of it here on the screen. This is what it looks like. But it's an informed affirmative consent that the patient can give the way it typically works. If a primary care, let's say, or medical home refers a patient to behavioral health, then the patient can affirm their consent to share their medical information with the behavioral health provider. And then when they get over to the behavioral health provider, they can use a similar app to basically say, give informed affirmative consent to share their behavioral health information with their primary care. And that way, there's a clear line of consent of what to share. And in on the slide, you see that the who and to whom information, who's disclosing and to whom is being disclosed. This particular example is to a care team. This was in the context of one of the tools that we're using as part of the Unify POC as a tool called Care Nexus. They used to be called, when SAMHSA owned it, used to be called Omnibus Care Plan. And this was to give consent to members of the care team, which was a mixed, diverse team which included the primary care, included behavioral health, included the school nurse, and several other parties who were participating in creating a plan of care and marking progress against it. In Project Unify, one of the things that we'll wind up having to address, and Brian, I think, alluded to this earlier, are some of the other aspects of this that go beyond just affirming consent, but also being able to have static markings on data to check consent later. But what consent to share does today is to give you affirmative consent now to share information, and that consent can stay there until the person revokes it. But in the human services world, there's a need for data to be, copies of data to be stored and perhaps retrieved at some point in the future outside of this current consent chain. So one of the challenges that we need to address is then how do you mark that information and check the consent maybe 2 years from now when the data is actually being retrieved. So there are several interesting aspects that can extend the functionality here that Project Unify will take on. As mentioned, we won't be able to take on everything, but there are parts of the problem, as Brian's layer cake on the prior slide attests. We won't be able to address everything, but we will address the parts of it that we can.
I think that gets us to the final slide in this section. Yeah.
Oh, there was. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So we do know that there are lots of questions that we need to deal with and need to come up with answers for in the coming months. And that includes, for instance, forgive me, Tom, did you want to talk to the slide?
No, go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
Okay. For instance, thinking back a few slides to where I said that child welfare was one of those, major use cases where somebody, where a case manager may collect a piece of medical record for a child in state care and then is required by law to store it away separate from the HIE or electronic health record system. Well, what happens if 5 years later, somebody within child welfare comes along and says, hey, I want to take a look at little Jameson's old healthcare record? Well, it's sitting there in a child welfare in an OCFS type database. But shouldn't that piece of medical information still be covered by patient confidentiality and require a requested consent to share for this new person to come along and look at it? Matter of fact, it should require that consent to share, even if it was the same old case manager from 5 years earlier, because somewhere along the way they could have lost their consent to actually see that information. So we need to have some notion of the cross-domain provenance associated with that medical record. What healthcare system did it come out of so that a consent to share can be requested? And, assuming that we've got multiple agencies, multiple information domains that are all sharing information, who defines the trust relationships between these different organizations in basically different industries? And how do we ensure that a domain receiving that data is going to abide by the consent requirements, the confidentiality requirements that have been created by the owner of the data, assuming the owner is the client or the patient? And then data ownership. Really, who does own this data? Is it the client? Is it the patient? Is it the state or the doctor's office? And what are the legal requirements for enforcing that kind of data ownership? And finally, amongst many other questions still to come, is governance. What organization has responsibility for defining these policies, procedures, rules? And how do we ensure that these policies, procedures, and rules are defined in a fair and equitable and just manner? So these are all wonderful questions that we're going to be wrestling with over the coming months, and we really look forward to folks joining us in chewing through these difficult issues. I return it to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for a high-level overview of this really complicated test. There's been a couple of questions coming in. We have time for just a few before we jump into our breakout groups. But this idea of, and I'm also interested in Tom's perspective around, is this a model that can be expanded on from SAMHSA in terms of really operationalizing things? And then secondly, it's the the anonymization of data, and how secure is that as we go forward on this? Both topics. I don't know if you have an answer, but certainly topics.
Yeah, actually, I would say take them one at a time. One, as far as the extensibility of consent to share, yes, and actually, I think one of our core team members here on Project Unify. If y'all are familiar with Brian Book, I don't know if Brian made the call today, but shout out Brian if you're there. From Book Zerman, has incorporated consent to share into the Care Nexus platform. And they are sort of the care and feeding of an extended version of it at the moment, and we're hoping to make use of that in the proof of concept here. As far as the anonymization goes, I guess it depends on what, if you're talking about straight anonymization or pseudonymization. For those of you who are not familiar with that, anonymization means basically masking the identity so that it can't be revealed, versus pseudonymization, which does the same thing, but it allows you to path back to identification. That would be for use cases like disease control, where you need to locate individuals, as opposed to most health research activities, which can use data that's been fully de-identified. Yeah, so there are many flowers blooming in that front. Many of them have to do with different forms of encryption and hashing and things like that. So, so I think there are a lot of tools to choose from on the anonymization front. I don't know if I answered the college question.
Yeah, I think you did. I think, again, complicated topic here, lots of different pieces of it. I'm going to draw attention to San Diego did some wonderful work on their privacy and confidentiality model with IBM as well. And that paper is on the NICS site. I'm going to put a link into it here momentarily, or I'll make sure it's available. That really, sort of segments the data utilization and the different levels of security that are required to get access to it, and was a very thoughtful piece of work that is driving the California work right now, or at least the San Diego work right now. And I think a couple of other counties, I think LA and maybe Sonoma, have picked up on that model. So that's something to look at as well. So I think there's a lot of good work that's been going on, or attempts to address this topic across the country. I think part of our effort will be to bring together that thinking as well. So we're ideally not starting from scratch again, and then making that available as well. And we plan to be doing a toolkit, not a toolkit, well, later a toolkit, but a training module on some of the basics of confidentiality and privacy over the next couple of months. So that will become available through our training program, which we'll talk about in the future. So what I want to do is, we're getting close to our normally scheduled time here. And I know people have busy days, but we would definitely appreciate you folks to join us for some conversation for a bit of time. We're going to break into 4 or 5 groups here. There's a prepared question, a number of moderators that will be in the conversation, and it's an opportunity to talk about the POC and other topics that have been raised here. So we'll talk from 12:30 or so, once we get the groups up, until about 1:45, just take 15 minutes, and then we'll come back together, share some ideas. Moderators, if you don't mind, just sort of marking down if there's any couple of ideas that are important for us to be capturing. And so with that, I know some people have to transition, so if you do, thank you very much. And this is the question we'll see up on the screen here when you come to your groups. So Mike is going to automatically magically put us into different rooms. We'll have moderators. Please join the conversation. And as I said, it's an experiment for us to get better at doing this as we go into more detailed breakouts over time here. So with that, for those of you we're not going to see later, thank you for joining today. We'll see you next week. And Mike, if you can just move us into the groups and see what we got. Thanks, everyone. And presto.
Sorry, we're not quite at presto. Just let me look to make sure I've got our moderators set up properly. Okay. We've got 4 rooms. hold on, one more change. Okay, here we go.